Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a historical rabbit hole, a journey back to eras long past where the simple act of existing was, well, an extreme sport. Imagine for a moment, you wake up not in your comfy bed but on a straw mat, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and something vaguely sulfuric. You reach for a glass of water, but there's no tap. It's just a communal well where everyone, and I mean everyone, washes their feet. The concept of deodorant? A futuristic dream? Toilet paper? Let's just say you'd be getting very familiar with sponges on sticks, or maybe just a smooth stone if you were lucky. This isn't just about ancient battles or grand empires. It's about the nitty-gritty, the truly unglamorous reality of daily survival. You probably wouldn't last a day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always cool to see where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're kicking things off in ancient Greece, a place often romanticized for its philosophers, its stunning architecture, and the birth of democracy. But peel back the marble veneer, and you'll find a world that would make your modern nose wrinkle in disgust. Think about hygiene, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. See your average Athenian citizen. The kind who might spend his days debating politics in the agora wasn't exactly fresh as a daisy. Public baths existed, sure. But they were more about socializing and splashing around in lukewarm, often murky water that dozens of others had already enjoyed. It wasn't about getting truly clean, not by our standards. Soap as we know it simply didn't exist. Instead, people used olive oil to clean themselves. You'd rub it on, let it absorb the dirt and sweat, and then scrape it off with a strigil, a curved metal tool. Imagine doing that after a long, sweaty day, feeling a thin film of oil and grime clinging to your skin. Lovely. And speaking of hygiene, let's talk about dental care, or the absence of it. Your ancient Greek smile would likely be a mosaic of missing teeth, cavities, and gums that were, shall we say, less than healthy. They chewed on mastic tree resin for fresh breath and used rough cloths to wipe their teeth, but advanced dentistry was centuries away. A toothache could easily turn into a life-threatening infection with no antibiotics to save you. Historians still argue whether their diet of coarse grains and limited sugar actually made their teeth better than ours. Despite the lack of care, simply because they weren't constantly bombarded with sugary processed foods. That's a debate for another night, perhaps. But either way, flossing wasn't on the menu. Then there's the issue of waste. Athens, a bustling city of tens of thousands, lacked any sophisticated sewage system. Human and animal waste, along with all manner of refuse, was often simply tossed into the streets or collected in cesspits that would occasionally overflow. The smell must have been distinctive. And flies. Oh, the flies. They would have been everywhere, buzzing around the unsanitary conditions, carrying disease from one person to another with delightful efficiency. You'd be constantly swatting them away, knowing full well they just landed on something you really don't want to think about. This pervasive filth contributed to a constant low hum of disease. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, these weren't rare occurrences. They were just part of the background noise of daily life. A common cold could easily morph into something fatal, especially for the young and the old, whose immune systems were constantly under siege. Even the simplest wound could become infected, leading to gangrene and often amputation or death. Forget about your little scraped knee. In ancient Greece, that was a serious concern. And the diet, while seemingly simple and healthy, lots of grains, olives, figs, and some fish, it was also often monotonous, and for the poor, barely sufficient. Malnutrition was a constant threat, weakening bodies and making them even more susceptible to the myriad of diseases lurking in the shadows of the unhygienic cities. So, while you might dream of strolling through the Parthenon, engaging in deep philosophical discussions, remember, you'd be doing it while probably smelling faintly of rancid olive oil, surrounded by flies, and hoping that little cut on your foot doesn't become the end of your philosophical journey. So, you've survived your first day in ancient Athens, smelling like an olive oil-soaked rag and constantly itching. Now, imagine you need to get somewhere, say from Rome to Gaul, or perhaps just across the vast Roman Empire. You're thinking, the Romans. Famous for their roads. And you'd be right, they were engineering geniuses. building an astonishing network of paved routes that stretched for thousands of miles across their vast dominion. You picture straight, smooth, well-maintained highways, perfect for a leisurely carriage ride. And that's where your modern sensibilities would lead you astray. Straight into a bone-rattling, potentially life-threatening journey. First off, while the roads were indeed paved, they weren't exactly smooth. Imagine cobblestones, but worse. Much, much worse. These were often uneven, rutted surfaces, designed for legions marching in lockstep in heavy carts, not for your delicate posterior. If you were lucky enough to travel by carriage, and only the very wealthy could afford such a luxury, you'd be bouncing and jolting so violently, you'd wonder if your teeth were going to rattle out of your skull. The suspension on these vehicles was rudimentary at best, basically just the elasticity of the wood itself. So say goodbye to any notion of a comfortable nap. Every bump, every stone, every dip would be felt directly in your spine. Think of it as an extreme full-body workout, whether you wanted one or not. And then there's the speed, or lack thereof. Even on these famed Roman roads, travel was painfully slow. A good day's journey might cover 20 to 30 miles if you were on foot or leading a pack animal. Horse-drawn carts could go a bit faster, maybe 40 to 50 miles. But that was pushing it, and your animals would be exhausted. Compare that to a modern car zipping along at 70 miles per hour, covering hundreds of miles in a day, and you begin to grasp the sheer scale of the time commitment. A trip from Rome to Britain, for instance, wasn't a quick hop across the channel. It was a grueling, months-long odyssey. You'd be spending a significant chunk of your life just getting from point A to point B. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort and the snail's pace. Roman roads, for all their engineering prowess, were not always safe. Highway robbery was a very real, very common threat. Bandits lurked in forested areas and remote stretches, eager to relieve travelers of their valuables. And since there was no centralized police force patrolling the entire network, your safety largely depended on your luck and the size of your retinue. If you were a lone traveler, you were practically a moving target. Even if you survived the bandits, there were still wild animals to contend with, especially in less settled regions. Wolves, bears, they weren't just in the distant wilderness. They were a legitimate danger on the fringes of the empire. Accommodation along the way was also a gamble. While the Romans did have mansionese for state couriers and military personnel, these were often basic, noisy, and not exactly clean. For the average traveler, you'd be relying on private hospices or even just camping out by the roadside, hoping for the best. And basic is putting it mildly. Think of it as a barn with a roof, a dirt floor, and maybe a straw pallet if you were lucky. Food would be whatever you carried or what little you could procure along the way. Often stale bread, cheese, and watered-down wine. The concept of a roadside diner with clean restrooms and hot coffee was a futuristic fantasy. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of lead in Roman plumbing and cooking vessels led to widespread lead poisoning among travelers, contributing to their generally shorter lifespans. It's certainly a less appetizing thought for your journey, isn't it? So, while the image of Roman roads evokes power and efficiency, the reality of traversing them was far from glamorous. You'd arrive at your destination exhausted, filthy, possibly poorer, and definitely with a few new aches and pains. It makes your modern commute, even in rush hour, seem like a luxurious pleasure cruise. You'd probably spend your first week back just recovering from the journey, perhaps wondering if it was even worth it.
Yes.
And remember, no in-flight entertainment. Mile after mile of the same dusty, bumpy, potentially dangerous path. Having perhaps limped your way off a Roman road, you now find yourself in the heart of the Middle Ages. A time often called the Dark Ages, though historians prefer medieval period. And when it comes to medicine, dark feels pretty accurate. Forget everything you know about sterile environments, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. In this era, falling ill wasn't just unpleasant. It was a terrifying roll of the dice where the odds were heavily stacked against you. Imagine, for a moment, a simple cut on your hand. Today, you'd clean it, slap on a Band-Aid, maybe a dab of antiseptic, and forget about it. In the Middle Ages, that little cut could be a death sentence. Without any knowledge of bacteria, wounds were breeding grounds for infection. Pus, swelling, fever. These were not just symptoms. They were often the precursors to gangrene and limb amputation, performed without anesthesia, using crude, unsterilized tools. The screams, my friend, would echo through the village. And if you survived the amputation, the chances of dying from infection afterward were still incredibly high. Makes you appreciate your local urgent care clinic, doesn't it? The prevailing medical theory was humorism, a concept inherited from the Greeks and Romans. The body was believed to be made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was simply an imbalance of these humors. So what was the cure for too much blood? Bleeding you, of course. Bloodletting was a remarkably common practice, sometimes using leeches, sometimes by simply cutting a vein. The idea was to drain the bad blood out. Never mind that it often weakened the patient further, leaving them anemic and more vulnerable. Too much phlegm? Perhaps a vigorous purge to induce vomiting. Sounds less like a cure and more like a torture session. Quirky tidbit. If you had a headache, a common medieval remedy was to tie a rope around your head. Or even drill a hole in your skull, a practice known as trepanation, believed to release evil spirits or relieve pressure. Yes, you heard that right. 2. To your head. While some might survive this, many didn't. And even if you did, you'd likely be left with a rather large, visible scar and perhaps some new cognitive challenges. Imagine trying to explain that to your medieval therapist. For widespread diseases like the plague, which swept through Europe with terrifying regularity, medieval medicine was utterly helpless. People tried everything from carrying posies of sweet-smelling herbs to prayer, flagellation, and burning witches. None of it worked. The Black Death alone wiped out an estimated 1/3 to half of Europe's population. It's almost unfathomable, the sheer scale of death and the desperate, often bizarre, attempts to ward it off. Your chances of making it through an epidemic were purely down to luck, or perhaps genetic predisposition that medieval doctors could impossibly fathom. Historians still argue whether some medieval remedies, like herbal concoctions, had any actual medicinal value, or if they were entirely based on superstition. Some herbs, we now know, do have properties that can aid healing or relieve symptoms. Imprecise and mixed with rituals that had no scientific basis. You'd be given a potion made from dozens of ingredients, some helpful, some harmless, and some potentially toxic, with no understanding of dosages or interactions. It was literally a shot in the dark. Childbirth was another incredibly perilous event. Without proper sanitation, medical knowledge, or pain relief, both mother and child faced extremely high mortality rates. Many women simply didn't survive, and if they did, their children often succumbed to childhood diseases like measles, smallpox, or whooping cough before reaching adulthood. The average life expectancy was incredibly low, not because people aged faster, but because so many died young from preventable or treatable conditions. So, next time you feel a sniffle coming on, just remember the medieval doctor, their leeches, and their tree-finding tools, and you'll probably feel a lot better about your modern medicine cabinet. It wasn't just an unpleasant experience. It was a gamble with your very existence. All right, you've somehow dodged the medieval doctor's drill, and now you're about to set sail, metaphorically, for now, to the world of the Vikings. Popular culture paints a picture of glorious warriors, horned helmets, and daring explorations. But the reality of Viking life was far less glamorous, more challenging, and definitely not for the faint of heart. Imagine stepping into a typical Viking longhouse. Forget your cozy, insulated modern home. This would be a dark, smoky, single-room dwelling, shared not just with your extended family but also with your livestock. Especially during the harsh Scandinavian winters, the animals provided warmth, sure, but also odors, flies, and their own charming contributions to the overall hygiene, or lack thereof. The smoke from the central hearth, which provided heat and cooking fire, would fill the air, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine layer of soot. Constant exposure to this smoke would lead to respiratory problems like chronic coughs and lung ailments, making every breath a minor battle. Your modern lungs, accustomed to clean, filtered air, would stage an immediate protest. And let's talk about that cold. Scandinavian winters are brutal. While the longhouse provided some shelter, drafts would be constant, and warmth was a precious commodity. You'd be bundled in layers of wool and furs, perpetually feeling a chill seeping into your bones. Frostbite was a very real danger, leading to lost fingers, toes, and even limbs. A simple cold could quickly escalate into pneumonia, a swift killer in an era without antibiotics. You'd spend a good portion of the year just trying to stay warm enough to survive. While Vikings are famed for their seafaring, the reality of life aboard a longship was incredibly tough. These open-decked vessels offered no real shelter from the elements. Imagine days, weeks, even months spent exposed to bitter winds, freezing rain, and relentless sea spray. There were no cabins, no bunks. You'd sleep curled up on the deck, perhaps under a simple hide, constantly damp and cold. Food would be dried meat, hardtack, and fermented drinks, often monotonous and unappetizing. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a constant threat on long voyages, leading to bleeding gums, rotten teeth, and eventually death. And the smell? A potent mix of unwashed bodies, stale food, and seawater. If you thought ancient Greek travel was rough, this was a whole new level of discomfort. Quirky tidbit. Despite the common perception, Vikings were surprisingly keen on personal grooming compared to some of their European contemporaries. They used ear spoons, tweezers, combs, and even small beauty kits for plucking facial hair.
Ow!
This doesn't mean they smelled like roses, but they did make an effort to appear neat, especially before a gathering or a raid. Historians still argue whether this relative cleanliness was due to practical reasons or simply a cultural preference for orderliness. But even with their combs, living conditions were still incredibly harsh. And then there's the violence. While not every Viking was a raider, violence was a pervasive part of their society. Disputes could escalate quickly, often settled by force. Life was cheap, and a bad harvest or a rival clan could mean starvation or a sudden brutal end. Death from battle, disease, or accident was an ever-present specter. You'd have to be constantly vigilant, strong, and prepared to defend yourself and your family. The romanticized image of the fearless warrior often overlooks the underlying fear and constant struggle for survival. You'd need a truly iron constitution and a spirit as tough as a winter storm to last a day in a Viking village, let alone on a longship. So, you've decided the Viking longhouse isn't quite your cup of fermented mead. Perhaps a warmer climate would suit you better. Let's transport ourselves to ancient Egypt, land of pharaohs, pyramids, and glistening Nile waters. It sounds exotic, doesn't it? Sun-drenched landscapes, monumental architecture, and a seemingly abundant civilization. But for the vast majority of people, life in ancient Egypt was a relentless cycle of hard labor, pervasive disease, and a constant struggle against the whims of the Nile and the gods. Your day would likely begin at dawn, not with a leisurely coffee, but with the immediate demands of agriculture. Over 80% of the population were farmers tied to the fertile lands along the Nile. You'd be out in the fields, under the blazing Egyptian sun, toiling from sunrise to sunset. Think about it. No tractors, no irrigation pumps, just your own muscle, a simple hoe, and perhaps the help of an ox. Plowing, sowing, harvesting. It was back-breaking work, day in and day out, all to produce enough food to feed yourself, your family, and crucially, to pay taxes to the pharaoh in the form of grain. Your muscles would ache constantly, and your skin would be perpetually parched and cracked by the sun and dust. The Nile, while the lifeblood of Egypt, also brought its own set of dangers. The annual flood, essential for fertilizing the fields, also left behind stagnant pools of water as it receded. These pools were perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which in turn carried a delightful array of parasitic diseases. Schistosomiasis, or snail fever, was endemic. This parasitic worm would enter your body through the skin from contaminated water, leading to chronic fatigue, internal organ damage, and a slow, debilitating decline. You'd feel constantly weak, your belly might swell, and you'd have no idea why. It's a far cry from a refreshing dip in the river. Quirky tidbit. Ancient Egyptians were surprisingly sophisticated about their appearance, at least the wealthy ones. They used kohl for eyeliner, mixed malachite powder with oil to create green eyeshadow, and even had rudimentary forms of perfume. However, for the common laborer, these luxuries were distant dreams. Your daily scent would be a mix of sweat, dust, and whatever livestock you happen to be working with. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of lead-based cosmetics among the elite contributed to their health issues. Despite their supposed protective qualities, and speaking of health, diet for the average Egyptian was primarily barley bread and beer, supplemented with some vegetables, onions, and occasionally fish. While seemingly simple, this diet could be incredibly repetitive and often nutritionally deficient, especially for those who didn't have access to varied produce. Dental health was atrocious. The process of grinding grain for bread often left tiny particles of sand and grit in the flour. Over a lifetime, chewing this gritty bread would wear down your teeth, exposing the pulp and leading to agonizing abscesses and infections. Skeletons from ancient Egypt frequently show severe dental wear and related bone infections in the jaw. Imagine the constant dull ache or the searing pain of an exposed nerve with no dentist to call upon. Life expectancy was low, around 30 to 35 years for men and slightly less for women due to the dangers of childbirth. Infancy and childhood were particularly perilous, with high mortality rates from infections, parasites, and malnutrition. Your family would likely be large, not out of choice, but out of necessity, hoping that enough children survive to help with labor and care for you in your old age, if you were lucky enough to reach it. So, while the pyramids stand as a testament to their incredible civilization, remember the millions of ordinary Egyptians who toiled under the sun, battled unseen parasites, and endured constant physical hardship to build that legacy. You wouldn't last a day without succumbing to disease or the sheer exhaustion of their daily grind. Having escaped the endless toil and parasitic threats of ancient Egypt, let's now journey across the vast ocean, back in time, to the heart of the Aztec Empire. This was a civilization of immense power, stunning artistry, and a truly uninspiring capital city, Tenochtitlan, built on a lake. Sounds magnificent, doesn't it? A vibrant, complex society, but for you, a modern individual dropped into this world. It would be a place of rigid social order, pervasive spiritual demands, and consequences for transgression that would make your jaw drop. First, let's talk about the constant presence of the divine and the demands that came with it. The Aztecs believed their gods needed to be appeased with human blood and hearts to ensure the sun rose each day and the world continued to exist. This led to ritual human sacrifice on a scale that is genuinely difficult for modern minds to comprehend. If you were a prisoner of war, your fate was likely sealed on the sacrificial stone atop the Templo Mayor, your heart offered to the sun god Huitzilopochtli. Even if you weren't a sacrificial victim, the constant awareness of this practice, the sight of the skull racks, displaying thousands of human skulls, would be a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the absolute power of the gods and the priests. It's a far cry from your Sunday morning service. Beyond the religious demands, Aztec society was incredibly hierarchical and strict. Every aspect of life was governed by an elaborate set of rules and expectations. Your status was largely determined by birth, and moving up the social ladder was incredibly difficult, unless you proved yourself exceptionally in battle. If you were a commoner, your life revolved around agricultural labor, paying tribute to the empire and military service when called upon. There was very little room for individual ambition or deviation from the norm, and if you stepped out of line, the consequences were severe. Quirky tidbit: the Aztecs had a surprisingly sophisticated postal system, with runners relaying messages and even fresh fish from the coast to the emperor's table in Tenochtitlan, covering hundreds of miles in a day. It was remarkably efficient, but you wouldn't be sending any casual postcards. Historians still argue about the true extent of the Aztecs' medical knowledge, particularly regarding herbal remedies and surgical practices, given the limited surviving texts. They did, however, have specialist healers who understood many plant properties. The legal system was brutal. Theft, adultery, drunkenness, and even speaking disrespectfully to an elder could be met with harsh penalties, including public humiliation, enslavement, or even death. Imagine a society where getting a bit too tipsy could lead to you being beaten or having your head shaved publicly. There was no concept of a fair trial as we understand it. Justice was swift and often unforgiving, designed to maintain social order through fear. You'd need to be constantly on your best behavior, acutely aware of every word and action, lest you inadvertently offend someone powerful or break an obscure social taboo. Even the architecture, while impressive, had a certain intimidating grandeur. The city of Tenochtitlan, with its massive temples and causeways, reflected the power of the state and the gods. The canals that crisscrossed the city were vital for transport, but also for waste disposal, meaning the water. While central to life was far from pristine, the smells would be a mixture of cooking fires, damp earth, human activity, and the ever-present scent of copal incense used in rituals. So while the Aztec Empire represents a fascinating peak of Mesoamerican civilization, your modern sensibilities would quickly be overwhelmed by its intensity. The constant spiritual pressure, the omnipresent threat of harsh punishment, and the daily grind of tribute and labor would make you long for the relative freedoms and comforts of your own time. You wouldn't last a day without either offending a priest, getting lost in the labyrinthine social rules, or simply succumbing to the overwhelming strictures of their demanding world. Alright, you've wisely decided the Aztec way of life. With its demands for hearts and adherence to strict codes isn't quite your vacation ideal. Let's pivot from the humid lowlands to the breathtaking yet brutally challenging Andean mountains and enter the world of the Inca Empire. This civilization, stretching thousands of miles along the spine of South America, was a marvel of organization and engineering, conquering dizzying altitudes and diverse terrains. Sounds adventurous, doesn't it? But while their infrastructure was indeed astonishing, daily life for you would be a relentless battle against a harsh environment and an equally demanding state. First and foremost, the altitude. If you're not accustomed to living at 8,000 to 14,000 feet above sea level, you'd be gasping for breath from your very first step. Thin air means less oxygen, leading to immediate symptoms like headaches, nausea, dizziness, and extreme fatigue. This soroche, or altitude sickness, wouldn't be a temporary inconvenience. It would be a constant companion for weeks, if not months, as your body struggled to acclimatize. Imagine trying to perform manual labor, like farming on steep terraces or carrying heavy loads, while feeling perpetually short of breath and lightheaded. Your modern lungs, used to sea-level oxygen, would likely stage a dramatic protest. The Inca, famous for their astounding stone masonry and vast network of roads, managed their empire through meticulous organization and a system of compulsory labor known as meta. This wasn't slavery as we might understand it, but rather a rotational labor draft, where every able-bodied commoner owed a certain amount of time to the state. You might be building roads, working in mines, or participating in agricultural projects for the state, often far from your home village. This meant long periods away from your family, performing arduous tasks, often in challenging conditions, with little personal autonomy. Your life was structured by the needs of the empire. Quirky tidbit: the Inca used a complex system of knotted strings called quipu to record information. From census data and tribute records to historical narratives, these weren't just simple tallies. They were sophisticated mnemonic devices that allowed administrators to manage a vast empire without a written language. Historians still argue over whether quipu were a form of writing or simply a sophisticated accounting tool. But either way, you wouldn't be able to read one, making communication with officialdom a truly frustrating experience. Food, while generally abundant due to their sophisticated agricultural techniques like terracing and irrigation, was often monotonous. Potatoes, maize, and quinoa formed the staples, supplemented by some dried meat. While nutritious, the preparation was basic and variety was limited. You'd be chewing a lot of tubers. And forget refrigeration. Food preservation was through drying and salting, which, while effective, certainly didn't enhance the flavor. The climate itself presented relentless challenges. In the high Andes, daily temperature swings are extreme. Freezing nights would give way to intensely sunny days, and unpredictable hailstorms or sudden blizzards could strike at any time. Even in what we'd consider summer months, your clothing made of woven llama or alpaca wool would be warm. But keeping dry and maintaining core body temperature would be a constant battle against the elements. You'd be perpetually cold, especially your feet. Housing was typically made of stone or adobe with thatched roofs. While sturdy, they would be dark and simple, designed for function rather than comfort. The focus was on communal life and contributing to the empire. There was little concept of individual privacy or personal space. You'd be living cheek by jowl with your extended family, with limited possessions and strict social expectations. Breaking social norms, even seemingly minor ones, could result in harsh community censure or punishment from imperial officials. So, while the Incas' achievements in engineering and social organization were truly remarkable, your average day would be defined by thin air, back-breaking labor for the state, and a constant struggle against the unforgiving Andean environment. You would unlast a day without succumbing to altitude sickness, or the sheer physical demands of a life so rigidly structured by the empire. Okay, you've survived the dizzying heights of the Andes and the relentless demands of the Inca Empire. Now, let's travel to an entirely different continent in a later period. Stepping into the formidable, long-lived Ming dynasty of China. This era, spanning from the 14th to the 17th century, was a period of immense cultural flowering, grand construction projects like the Great Wall, and vast economic power. Sounds impressive, a golden age even. But for the ordinary citizen, life under the Ming was often characterized by pervasive state control, crushing taxes, and the ever-present threat of bureaucratic inefficiency or outright corruption. Imagine your life as a peasant farmer in Ming China. Your days would be dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the imperial bureaucracy. You'd spend your waking hours toiling in rice paddies or dry fields, cultivating crops to feed your family and, more importantly, to pay your taxes. And these weren't just monetary taxes. Often they were paid in grain, in silk, or in labor. The labor system meant you could be called upon at any time to work on massive public projects, building canals, repairing walls, or transporting goods for the state, for weeks or even months far from your home with little to no compensation. Your family would suffer in your absence, struggling to maintain the farm. It was a constant struggle for subsistence, where a bad harvest or a sudden flood could mean starvation. The Ming state was notoriously meticulous in its record-keeping and control. Every household was registered, every person tracked. The legis system organized rural communities into groups of 10 households, with rotating leadership responsible for tax collection and labor service. This meant your neighbors were, in a sense, agents of the state, ensuring compliance. There was little privacy, and even less room for dissent. Questioning authority or failing to meet your quotas could lead to severe punishment, often public and humiliating. Imagine feeling constantly under the watchful eye of the government, even in your own village. Quirky tidbit: the Ming dynasty saw a massive boom in porcelain production, with its distinctive blue and white ceramics becoming highly prized both domestically and abroad. Even commoners might have owned simple ceramic bowls. But the exquisite pieces you see in museums were strictly for the elite. Historians still argue about the precise impact of the Ming's maritime expeditions led by Zhen He, whether they were primarily for tribute collection, trade, or pure exploration, and why they were abruptly halted. This decision profoundly shaped China's future global engagement. Justice under the Ming was swift and often brutal, administered through a vast network of local magistrates and imperial courts. Torture was a common practice to extract confessions, and punishments ranged from public flogging with heavy bamboo sticks to exile, forced labor, or execution. Even minor offenses could have disproportionately severe consequences. Your modern legal protections and presumption of innocence would be utterly alien concepts. You'd live in constant fear of being accused, justly or unjustly, and facing the merciless hand of the law. Beyond the direct hand of the state, life was also precarious due to natural disasters. Floods from the Yellow River, droughts, and locust infestations could wipe out entire harvests, leading to widespread famine. While the state sometimes offered relief, it was often insufficient, and millions perished during such crises. Disease, as in previous eras, was an ever-present threat. Compounded by poor sanitation in crowded urban areas and limited medical knowledge, a simple epidemic could decimate a village or city. So, while the Ming dynasty built an empire of immense sophistication and cultural richness, for the common person, it was a life of unremitting toil, heavy taxation, constant surveillance, and the ever-present threat of harsh punishment or natural disaster. The grandeur of the Forbidden City and the artistry of porcelain were built on the backs of millions, whose lives were a struggle for survival under a powerful, pervasive bureaucracy. You wouldn't last a day trying to navigate its complex social structure and stringent demands. You've bravely navigated the bureaucratic maze and the weighty demands of Ming China. Now, let us leave the densely populated plains and rigid hierarchies behind and transport ourselves to the archipelago of feudal Japan, specifically into the tumultuous world of the samurai. Popular culture, especially movies and video games, often presents the samurai as stoic, honorable warriors, masters of the sword, living by a strict code of ethics. And while elements of that are true, the daily reality of a samurai's life was far from the romanticized ideal. It was a path fraught with constant peril, unwavering discipline, and the ever-present shadow of death or dishonor. First, the training. From a very young age, usually as soon as they could walk, a samurai's life was dedicated to martial arts. You wouldn't be playing with toys. You'd be practicing with wooden swords and bows, enduring rigorous physical conditioning, and learning horsemanship. Discipline was absolute, and mistakes were met with harsh correction. Your body would be covered in bruises, your muscles constantly aching. This wasn't just about physical prowess. It was about mental fortitude, learning to suppress fear and pain, to always be ready for battle. Imagine your childhood being a relentless boot camp every day, without exception. Then there's the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. This wasn't just a set of suggestions. It was a deeply ingrained philosophy that dictated every aspect of a samurai's life. Honor was paramount, sometimes more important than life itself. Loyalty to your lord was absolute, even if it meant sacrificing your own family or life. Failure, perceived or real, could lead to extreme shame. It's often culminating in seppuku ritual suicide as the only way to restore honor. You'd live with this immense psychological pressure, knowing that a single misstep, a moment of cowardice, or a failure to protect your lord could necessitate a gruesome end. It's a level of moral burden most of us can barely fathom. Quirky tidbit. Despite their fearsome reputation, many samurai were also highly educated and cultivated individuals. They practiced calligraphy, wrote poetry, participated in tea ceremonies, and studied philosophy and arts. This blend of martial prowess and artistic refinement was considered essential for a well-rounded warrior. Historians still argue about the precise origins and evolution of Bushido, and whether it was a formalized code or a set of unwritten ideals that developed over centuries. It certainly wasn't a single document you could look up. Daily life for a samurai, even in peacetime, involved constant vigilance. You might be guarding your lord, patrolling his lands, or engaging in endless training drills. Your sword, the katana, wasn't just a weapon. It was considered the soul of the samurai, treated with reverence and maintained meticulously. You'd be expected to be proficient with it, ready to draw and strike in an instant. And the armor, while protective, was incredibly heavy and cumbersome, designed for battle, not comfort. Imagine wearing a suit of metal and lacquer for hours, in all weathers, ready to fight. Death was an ever-present companion, whether from battle, duels, or simply the endemic violence of feudal Japan. A samurai knew their life could end at any moment. There were no retirement plans, no cushy pensions for aging warriors. Your value was tied to your ability to serve and fight. Even if you survived countless battles, old age brought new challenges as your physical abilities declined and your worth to your lord diminished. So, while the image of the stoic samurai cutting down foes with elegant precision is compelling, the reality was a life of relentless training, brutal discipline, constant exposure to violence, and an overwhelming sense of duty and honor. Your comfort-seeking modern self would quickly buckle under the immense pressure. The physical hardship and the psychological weight of a life where death or dishonor lurked around every corner. You wouldn't last a day as a samurai without breaking or being broken. Alright. You've wisely decided that a life of constant battle readiness and ritual suicide might not be for you. Let's fast forward a bit, leaving feudal Japan behind, and plunge into the fascinating, yet often grim realities of early modern Europe. This period, roughly from the late 15th to the late 18th century, saw an incredible transformations. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and the dawn of modern science. Sounds like an exciting time, right? Vibrant tapestry of new ideas and discoveries. But for the vast majority of people, it was still a life steeped in poverty, punctuated by widespread disease, and often ruled by arbitrary power. Imagine for a moment, stepping into a bustling European city like London or Paris in, say, 1650, your senses would be immediately assaulted. The stench, oh, the stench. Open sewers ran down the center of many streets, filled with human and animal waste. Garbage was routinely tossed out of windows, mingling with the mud and horse droppings. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke from countless hearths, tanning hides, and overflowing latrines. A modern nose, accustomed to deodorizers and sanitation, would find it almost unbearable. Even the cleanest homes would have a pervasive, earthy smell. Disease was a constant lurking menace, far more terrifying than any bandit on a Roman road. Plagues, smallpox, typhus, dysentery. These weren't just historical footnotes. They were recurring nightmares that could wipe out entire families or villages in weeks. A single person falling ill could trigger a terrifying domino effect. There was no understanding of germ theory, so people continued practices that only spread disease, like living in overcrowded conditions, sharing unsanitary public spaces, and consuming contaminated water. If someone coughed near you, it wasn't just a rude gesture. It could be a death sentence. Quirky tidbit, despite the squalor. Early modern Europeans were often quite flamboyant in their fashion, especially the wealthy. Wigs, elaborate ruffles, and intricate embroidery were common. They would also carry pomanders filled with sweet-smelling herbs, less for perfume and more to try and mask the pervasive stench of daily life. Historians still argue about the exact impact of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling, on agricultural output and social unrest across Europe during this era. It certainly made the already difficult task of farming even more precarious. Medical knowledge remained rudimentary, a mix of ancient theories, folk remedies, and often dangerous practices. Bleeding, purging, and the application of bizarre poultices were still common treatments. If you broke a bone, it was likely to heal crookedly, if at all. Simple infection could escalate quickly, and amputation, if you were lucky enough to get one, was an excruciating, life-threatening procedure. Even childbirth remained incredibly dangerous for both mother and infant. The average lifespan, while slightly better than in the early Middle Ages, was still heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality rates. For the vast majority, life was an endless cycle of agricultural labor or grueling artisanal work. Most people lived in small villages tied to the land, their lives dictated by the seasons. Innovations like the printing press were transforming the world of ideas, but access to education was largely limited to the elite. Superstition and religious fervor still held sway, and fear of witchcraft or divine punishment was widespread. You'd live in a world where explanations for illness or misfortune were often supernatural, not scientific. So, while the early modern period laid the groundwork for the modern world, for you, a time traveler from the 21st century, it would be a shocking immersion into a world of pervasive smells, ever-present disease, and unrelenting physical hardship. You'd be constantly battling unsanitary conditions, fearing the next epidemic, and longing for the simple comfort of a hot shower and modern medicine. You wouldn't last a day without feeling utterly overwhelmed by the sheer griminess and precariousness of existence. All right, you've wisely decided that early modern Europe's charming blend of grand ideas and grander stenches is unquite your cup of tea. Let's leap across the Atlantic further into history and explore the rugged, unforgiving world of the American frontier. We're talking 18th and 19th century pioneer life, the era of westward expansion, log cabins, and endless wilderness. Popular narratives paint a picture of brave, self-reliant individuals carving out new lives, a testament to the American spirit. And while that grit was undeniably real, the actual experience of a pioneer was one of relentless, back-breaking toil, isolation, and constant confrontation with nature's harshest realities. Imagine waking up in a hastily constructed log cabin, perhaps just a single room, miles from your nearest neighbor. There's no running water, no electricity, no internet, and certainly no Amazon delivery. Every single thing you needed, food, clothing, tools, shelter, had to be made or acquired through sheer physical effort. Your day would begin before dawn and end long after dusk. Clearing land was an endless task, felling trees with an axe, digging out stubborn stumps, breaking new ground for planting. Your hands would be calloused, your muscles perpetually sore, and splinters would be a constant companion. You'd be living a literal farm-to-table life, except the farm was just dirt, and the table was a rough-hewn plank. Food security was a daily gamble. While you might hunt for game or fish in nearby rivers, your primary sustenance came from your crops, which were vulnerable to everything from sudden frosts and droughts to insect infestations and foraging animals. A single bad harvest could mean a winter of severe hunger. Your diet would be monotonous. Primarily cornmeal, cured meats, and whatever vegetables you managed to grow or forage. Fresh fruit and diverse flavors would be rare luxuries. You'd quickly learn to appreciate every calorie. Quirky tidbit, despite the harshness, pioneer communities often developed strong bonds of mutual aid. Holding barn raisings and quilting bees, where neighbors would come together to help each other construct buildings or prepare goods. This communal spirit was essential for survival. Historians still argue about the true ecological impact of pioneer expansion on the vast American wilderness, and whether the rapid deforestation and hunting truly represented an unsustainable assault on natural resources, or simply a necessary step in settlement. Healthcare. Forget it. You were your own doctor, or you relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. Or a serious illness or injury, miles from any trained physician, meant your chances of survival plummeted dramatically. Childbirth in a remote cabin, assisted only by a midwife or a neighbor, was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. Measles, diphtheria, smallpox, these common diseases, now largely eradicated or easily treatable, were often deadly for entire families. You lived with a constant awareness of mortality, seeing many loved ones succumb to conditions that today would be a minor inconvenience. Isolation was another profound challenge. Weeks or even months could pass without seeing anyone outside your immediate family. News from the outside world would arrive slowly, if at all, carried by infrequent travelers. The sheer loneliness, especially during long, harsh winters, could take a significant mental toll. You'd have to be incredibly self-sufficient, resilient, and resourceful, with no modern conveniences to ease the burden. Entertainment often consisted of storytelling, music, or simple games within the family unit. There were no movie nights, no streaming services, just the quiet hum of the wilderness. So, while the pioneer spirit embodies perseverance, the reality of living on the American frontier was a ceaseless battle against nature, disease, and isolation. Your soft hands and modern expectations for comfort and connectivity would be utterly out of place. You would not last a day without succumbing to the sheer physical exhaustion or the profound psychological impact of such a stark, demanding existence. You'd quickly learn that roughing it today is nothing compared to just living back then. You've bravely, or perhaps foolishly, decided that the sheer self-reliance and isolation of the American frontier is a bit too much self-reliance. So, let's dial it back slightly, geographically speaking, and land in colonial America, specifically in the bustling, yet deeply flawed English settlements of the 17th or 18th century. This era, often romanticized as a time of new beginnings and religious freedom, was indeed a foundational period for the United States. But for you, a modern individual, it would be a shocking immersion into a world rife with stark social inequalities, pervasive dangers, and a constant struggle for survival against disease and deprivation. First, the simple fact of arrival. If you came as an indentured servant, which many did, you'd essentially sold years of your labor for passage to the New World. You'd be living under conditions not far removed from slavery, working grueling hours, often in tobacco fields, under the strict control of a master. Even if you were a free settler, the journey itself was perilous. Cramped ships, disease, and storms were common. Upon arrival, you'd face the immense challenge of building a new life from scratch, often in a raw, untamed wilderness. The omnipresent threat of disease was chilling. Colonial settlements were often hotbeds for epidemics. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and smallpox ripped through communities with terrifying regularity. These diseases, often brought by European ships, found fertile ground in the close quarters and poor sanitation of early towns. There was no understanding of mosquito-borne illnesses, so you'd be constantly bitten, unknowingly exposing yourself to deadly pathogens. Medical treatment was rudimentary, relying on bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies of questionable efficacy. A common fever could quickly turn into a death sentence, and infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It's safe to say your modern immune system would be in for a rude awakening. Quirky tidbit. Despite the hardship, colonial Americans developed a fascinating array of folk remedies, some of which, by sheer chance, contained active compounds we recognize today. For instance, willow bark was used for pain relief, long before aspirin was synthesized. Historians still argue about the true demographic impact of disease on Native American populations during this period, and whether it was primarily European diseases or a combination of factors that led to their catastrophic decline. Social hierarchy was rigid, perhaps more so than you'd expect in a new world. While there might be more opportunity than in overcrowded Europe, society was far from egalitarian. Wealthy landowners, merchants, and ministers formed an elite class, while the vast majority were farmers, laborers, or artisans living a precarious existence. Women, regardless of class, had severely limited rights and opportunities. Their lives largely confined to the domestic sphere and child-rearing. Slavery, too, was a deeply entrenched and brutal institution, especially in the southern colonies, creating an underclass of unimaginable suffering. Justice was often harsh in public. Petty theft could result in public whippings or time in the stocks. More serious crimes meant execution, often by hanging, performed openly as a spectacle for the community. Religious zeal could also be a powerful and sometimes terrifying force. The Salem witch trials, while an extreme example, illustrate how accusations and superstition could lead to deadly consequences for anyone deemed different or challenging to the established order. You'd need to be incredibly careful about your words and actions, lest you attract unwanted attention in the daily grind. It was relentless. Farming was manual and grueling, requiring constant effort from every member of the family. Food was often bland and repetitive, centered around corn, salted meat, and whatever seasonal vegetables could be grown. Luxury goods were scarce and expensive. Even something as simple as fresh, clean water wasn't always readily available, leading to the common practice of drinking diluted cider or beer instead. While you might dream of forging a new life in the nascent American colonies, the reality would be a brutal awakening to pervasive disease, social strictures, and constant physical toil. Often under the shadow of arbitrary justice, you would unlast a day without succumbing to one of the myriad illnesses or simply being overwhelmed by the sheer harshness of existence. Having navigated the perils of colonial America, you've perhaps realized that founding a new nation isn't all it's cracked up to be. Let's fast forward once more, crossing the pond back to England, but this time into the very heart of the Victorian era. We're talking 19th century Britain, time of immense imperial power, technological innovation, and a veneer of polished respectability. You might envision elegant ladies and gentlemen, grand industrial exhibitions, and literary masterpieces. And while those existed, beneath that polite, prosperous surface lay an astonishing level of squalor. Stark class divisions and public health nightmares that would make your modern stomach churn. Imagine yourself in the sprawling metropolis of London, circa 1850. Forget the quaint, romanticized images. The air would be thick with smog from countless coal fires and industrial factories. A choking, acrid haze that would irritate your lungs and sting your eyes. The streets, especially in working-class districts, would be rivers of filth. Horse manure was everywhere, along with human waste, industrial effluents, and general refuse. The Thames River, the very artery of the city, was essentially an open sewer. Famously described during the Great Stink of 1858 as a Stygian gloom and a pestilential tide. Your modern sensibilities for clean air and water would be utterly horrified, and the living conditions for the vast majority appalling. The Industrial Revolution had driven massive migration to cities, leading to desperate overcrowding. Working-class families often lived in cramped, unventilated tenements, sometimes with multiple families sharing a single room. Access to clean water was limited, and sanitation facilities were practically non-existent. Communal privies, if they existed, were overflowing pits of disease. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis spread like wildfire through these densely packed, unsanitary areas, claiming countless lives. A trip to the public pump could expose you to deadly bacteria, and a simple cough from a neighbor could be the start of a fatal illness. Your immune system would be working overtime and likely losing the battle. Quirky tidbit. Despite the appalling public health conditions, the Victorian era also saw the rise of modern public health reforms, driven by figures like Edwin Chadwick and John Snow, who famously linked cholera to contaminated water. It was a slow, painful awakening, but the seeds of modern sanitation were planted during this grim period. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of Victorian workhouses. Whether they served as a necessary deterrent against idleness or simply as cruel, dehumanizing institutions for the destitute, the class divide was a chasm. While the wealthy lived lives of unimaginable luxury, waited on by armies of servants, the poor toiled in factories, mines, or as domestic servants, working incredibly long hours for pitiful wages. Child labor was rampant, with children as young as 5 working in dangerous conditions, their small bodies exploited for profit. There was no social safety net, no unemployment benefits, no health care for the poor. If you couldn't work, you starved or ended up in the dreaded workhouse, a grim institution designed to make poverty as miserable as possible. Justice was harsh and often biased against the poor. Public executions were still common until the mid-century, and petty theft could lead to imprisonment or even transportation to penal colonies like Australia. The police force, the bobbies, or peelers, were just emerging, and law enforcement was far less sophisticated than today. So, while the Victorian era gave us grand novels and impressive engineering, for you, a time traveler, expecting modern comforts and fairness, it would be a shocking descent into a world of pervasive grime, deadly disease, and brutal social inequality. You wouldn't last a day without succumbing to illness, the sheer physical toll of labor, or simply the overwhelming stench and misery of it all. You've bravely weathered the stench and social stratification of Victorian London. Now let's stay in the 19th century. Let's shift our focus directly to the engine that drove much of that Victorian progress, the Industrial Revolution. This period, roughly from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, was a time of unprecedented technological advancement. Steam power, factories, and mass production. It sounds like the birth of modernity, a leap forward for humanity. And in many ways it was. But for the millions who fueled this revolution with their labor, it was an era of brutal working conditions, horrific urban environments, and a profound dehumanization that would utterly shock your modern sensibilities. Imagine yourself as a factory worker in Manchester, Cottonopolis, a booming industrial city. Your workday would be incredibly long, to 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week, often with no breaks for meals. The factory floor would be a deafening cacophony of whirring machinery, the air thick with cotton dust, coal smoke, and the smell of grease and sweat. Safety regulations non-existent. Exposed gears, rapidly moving belts, and unshielded machines were everywhere. Accidents were incredibly common. Limbs crushed, fingers lost, scalps ripped off. And if you were injured, there was no workers' compensation, no sick pay. No. You were simply replaced, discarded like a broken part. Your modern understanding of workplace safety would be met with blank stares and probably a hearty laugh. Child labor was not just common, it was essential to the factory system. Children as young as 5 or 6 were employed for their small hands, often crawling under dangerous machinery to retrieve fallen bobbins or clean tight spaces. Their lives were tragically short, often ending in industrial accidents or from the respiratory diseases caused by inhaling dust and fumes. Imagine a factory floor filled with coughing, soot-stained children, their faces grim with exhaustion, performing hazardous tasks. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of progress. Quirky tidbit. One of the unsung heroes of the Industrial Revolution was the knocker-up, a person hired to tap on workers' windows with a long stick or throw pebbles to ensure they woke up for their impossibly early shifts.
Oh.
Long before alarm clocks were common. Historians still argue about whether the long-term benefits of industrialization, such as increased wealth and later improved living standards, justified the immense human suffering endured by the working class during its initial phases. It's a complex ethical dilemma, isn't it? The urban housing was just as grim as the factories. Rapid, unplanned growth led to the construction of vast slums, row upon row of cramped back-to-back houses, often without foundations, proper drainage, or ventilation. A single, usually contaminated water pump might serve dozens of families. The streets were open sewers, and disease was rampant. Cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis thrived in these conditions, tearing through families with terrifying efficiency. You'd be living in a constant state of fear, knowing that illness could strike at any moment, and there was little hope of recovery. Diet for the working class was poor and monotonous. Cheap bread, potatoes, and sometimes a bit of fatty meat or cheese, often adulterated with cheaper, less wholesome ingredients. Malnutrition was widespread, contributing to weakened immune systems and a general decline in health. The average height of working-class men actually decreased during the early Industrial Revolution due to poor diet and grueling labor. So, while the Industrial Revolution laid the groundwork for the modern world of abundance and technological marvels, for the individual living through its nascent stages, it was a brutal, dehumanizing experience. You'd be constantly exhausted, breathing polluted air, risking life and limb daily in the factory, and living in squalor. You wouldn't last a day without succumbing to the sheer physical toll, the pervasive illness, or simply the profound despair of such a relentless, unforgiving existence. You'd quickly realize that the gears of progress were often grinding up human lives. You've wisely decided that the suffocating smog and limb-shredding machinery of the Industrial Revolution are in quite your career calling. Let's dial back the clock significantly and journey to ancient Sparta, a name that immediately conjures images of fierce warriors, brutal discipline, and an almost mythical devotion to military excellence. This isn't ancient Athens with its messy democracy or early modern Europe with its dirty charm. This is Sparta, a society singularly focused on creating the most formidable soldiers in the known world. And for you, a product of modern comfort and individual freedom, it would be an unimaginable ordeal. From the moment you were born, if you were a male infant, your life was not your own. Your physical fitness was immediately assessed by a council of elders. If you were deemed too weak, too sickly, or deformed, you were exposed, left to die on Mount Tegidas. There was no concept of medical intervention to save you. Only the strong were allowed to survive. Imagine being judged at birth, your very right to exist resting on a cold clinical assessment by stern old men. Your modern welfare system and disability rights would be utterly alien concepts here. If you passed the initial inspection, your upbringing was anything but nurturing. At the age of 7, your childhood ended abruptly. You were taken from your family and entered the Agoge, the Spartan state-sponsored training system. This was a brutal, relentless regimen designed to strip away individuality and forge an obedient, resilient soldier. You'd live in communal barracks, not a cozy home. Food was deliberately meager and plain, encouraging you to steal to survive, not for nourishment, but to develop cunning and resourcefulness, if caught. However, the punishment was severe, not for stealing, but for being caught. Sleep would be on hard straw mattresses, clothes were minimal even in winter, and bathing was rare. Your body would be constantly aching from physical drills, your stomach constantly rumbling from hunger. Quirky tidbit: Spartan boys were often given only one cloak to wear throughout the year, regardless of the season, to accustom them to hardship. They also kept their hair long, a symbol of their freedom and a mark of distinction, especially after reaching adulthood. Historians still argue whether the legend of boys being flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia as a test of endurance was a literal practice, or a more symbolic ritual, though the archaeological evidence suggests it was indeed a brutal event designed to test their pain tolerance. Physical training was incessant and grueling. You'd run, wrestle, practice with spears and shields, often barefoot over rugged terrain. Pain was seen not as something to avoid, but as something to be endured and overcome. Floggings were a regular part of the training, designed to instill discipline and test endurance. You learned to fight, yes, but also to obey without question, to endure hardship without complaint, and to value the collective above all else. Individual expression was suppressed. Conformity was key. Your modern notions of personal space emotional support, and individual freedom would be utterly pulverized within days. Even outside the agoged, life for a Spartan male was defined by military service. You remained a soldier until the age of 60, always ready for battle. Marriage was less about love and more about producing more Spartan warriors. Your primary loyalty was to the state, not your family. The legendary phrase, "with it or on it," perfectly encapsulates the Spartan ethos. Retreat was not an option. Surrender was unthinkable. So, while Sparta produced arguably the most feared fighting force of the ancient world, it did so at an immense personal cost. Your pampered, freedom-loving, comfort-seeking modern self would find it an utterly intolerable existence. It wouldn't last a day in the agoge before your body gave out. Your spirit broke, or your refusal to conform led to your swift demise. You'd quickly discover that their legendary strength came from a system of sacrifice that few modern humans could possibly endure. Having narrowly escaped the brutal conditioning of Spartan life, you're probably craving a bit more intellectual stimulation, perhaps some public discourse, or even just a good play. So, let's pivot to ancient Athens, the supposed birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and theater. We touched on its hygiene horrors earlier, but there's more to unpack. While Athens is often celebrated as the cradle of Western civilization, for you, a modern individual, it would still present a host of discomforts, exclusions, and underlying harshness that would make you quickly appreciate your own era. First, let's address that democracy everyone talks about. While groundbreaking for its time, Athenian democracy was incredibly limited by modern standards. Only adult, free, Athenian-born men could participate. If you were a woman, a slave, or a metokoi, you had absolutely no political rights. You couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and your voice simply didn't matter in the grand debates. Imagine living in a society where your gender or your place of birth automatically excluded you from any meaningful participation in governance. Regardless of your intelligence or capabilities, your modern ideals of universal suffrage would be laughed out of the agora. And the notion of freedom? While free Athenian men had a certain degree of liberty, it was built on the backs of a massive slave population. Slavery was ubiquitous in Athens, forming the foundation of their economy and daily life. Slaves worked in mines, on farms, in workshops, and as domestic servants, often enduring brutal conditions. If you were unlucky enough to be captured in war or born into slavery, your life would be one of ceaseless toil. With no rights, no personal freedom, and the constant threat of violence or sexual abuse. Even for free citizens, the absence of modern amenities meant a life of far more physical exertion than you're accustomed to. Quirky tidbit. Despite their philosophical prowess, ancient Athenians had a strange custom of ostracism, where once a year, citizens could vote to exile any individual for 10 years, simply by writing their name on a piece of pottery. It was intended to prevent tyranny, but was often used to banish political rivals. Historians still argue whether the wealth generated by the silver mines of Laurion, largely worked by slaves, was the primary engine of Athenian power and cultural flourishing, or if their maritime trade and agricultural innovations were equally crucial. The judicial system, while involving citizen juries, could be fickle and based on rhetoric rather than objective evidence. Public speaking was paramount, and if you weren't skilled in argument, you could easily lose your case, with consequences ranging from fines to exile or even the death penalty. There was no concept of legal representation as we know it. You had to argue your own case. Imagine facing serious charges with only your wits to defend you against a skilled orator. And we circle back to the daily grind and physical discomfort. Remember the lack of sanitation from Section 1? That hasn't changed. Streets still reeked. Disease was prevalent, and clean water was a constant concern. Your diet would be simple: barley cakes, olives, figs, and wine, with meat being a rare luxury for most. Public spaces, while vibrant with discussion, were also crowded, dusty, and noisy. You'd be constantly aware of the sun beating down, the limited shade, and the ever-present threat of various ailments. Even their famed intellectual pursuits had their challenges. Scrolls were fragile and expensive, and reading was a slow, arduous process. There were no printing presses, no easy access to books, Education was largely oral, and memorization was key. So, while you might dream of debating philosophy with Plato or watching a play by Sophocles, the reality would involve navigating a highly unequal society, enduring unsanitary conditions, and constantly facing the threat of disease or arbitrary justice. You would unlast a day in ancient Athens without feeling completely disenfranchised, or utterly overwhelmed by its harsh realities, quite apart from the smells. All right, you've survived the intellectual debates and the questionable sanitation of ancient Athens. And you're probably yearning for a civilization that at least pretends to be clean. So, let's travel eastward to the glittering heart of the Byzantine Empire, specifically Constantinople in its golden age, say the 6th or 7th century. This was the continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, a bastion of Christian faith, incredible architecture, and sophisticated bureaucracy. You might imagine grand mosaics, opulent palaces, and a thriving commercial hub. And while the grandeur was undeniable for the ordinary citizen, life still harbored significant grime, constant threats, and a pervasive sense of instability. Constantinople was, by far, the largest and wealthiest city in Europe for centuries, boasting a population in the hundreds of thousands. While it did have more advanced water systems than many European cities of the time, including impressive aqueducts, bringing fresh water from miles away, and even some rudimentary public latrines, it was still a pre-modern metropolis. The sheer density of people meant that sanitation was a constant struggle. Animal waste, garbage, and human refuse would still accumulate in side streets and poorer districts, creating a potent urban aroma that your modern nose would find incredibly offensive. The golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia might dazzle your eyes, but the smells outside would surely curl your toes. Disease, as always, was an ever-present specter, and the famous plague of Justinian in the 6th century decimated the empire, killing tens of millions and profoundly impacting its future. This was a true pandemic, akin to the Black Death, and it repeatedly swept through the city and empire. Without understanding its bacterial cause, people were helpless. You'd live in constant fear of the next outbreak, knowing that a simple cough or fever in your household could swiftly become a death sentence for your entire family. Your modern medical understanding would be useless, and your sophisticated vaccines wouldn't exist. Quirky tidbit. The Byzantines were obsessed with chariot racing at the Hippodrome, a massive arena that could hold tens of thousands. Factions, known as the Blues and Greens, were fiercely loyal to their teams, and their rivalries often spilled over into violent street riots, sometimes even challenging imperial authority. Historians still argue about the precise reasons for the Byzantine Empire's millennial longevity, whether it was its strategic location, strong centralized bureaucracy, or adaptable military, or perhaps a combination of all three. Life in Constantinople, especially for the common person, was largely a struggle for subsistence. While the city was a center of trade, many citizens worked as artisans, laborers, or small merchants, often living in cramped, multi-story buildings. Wages were low, and food, though varied, could be expensive. Bread, wine, olive oil, and some vegetables formed the staples. Meat was less common, and usually reserved for special occasions. You'd be constantly haggling, trying to make ends meet in a bustling, competitive urban environment. Beyond disease and daily struggles, the Byzantine Empire was almost constantly at war, defending its vast borders against a myriad of enemies: Goths, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and later, Crusaders. This meant heavy taxation to fund the military and a constant drain on manpower. While you might not be fighting yourself, your sons might be conscripted, or your livelihood impacted by the ongoing conflicts. Political intrigue was also rampant within the imperial court, with emperors being overthrown, blinded, or murdered with alarming regularity. This created an underlying sense of instability, even amidst the grandeur. You'd never truly feel secure in your position or your future. So, while the Byzantine Empire offered a beacon of civilization in a tumultuous world, for you, a modern individual, it would be a surprising blend of awe-inspiring splendor and pervasive griminess. You'd be battling persistent urban smells, fearing the next plague, and navigating a society where political stability was a precious, often fleeting commodity. You wouldn't last a day without being utterly overwhelmed by the chaotic energy, the constant threats, and the surprising lack of everyday comfort beneath the imperial pomp. You've dodged the plagues and political machinations of the Byzantine Empire. Perhaps you're thinking, surely a cause, a grand purpose would make hardship more bearable? Let's find out by hurtling back to the 11th, 12th, or 13th century and joining the ranks of the Crusaders. This was an era defined by religious fervor, noble quests, and epic battles for the Holy Land. Sounds like a grand adventure, a pilgrimage of faith, doesn't it? But the reality of participating in the Crusades was a grinding, brutal ordeal of unimaginable physical suffering, pervasive disease, and a level of filth that would test the strongest of wills. First, the journey itself. Forget comfortable travel. You'd be marching hundreds, often thousands of miles across unfamiliar and hostile terrain, typically on foot, burdened by heavy armor, weapons, and whatever meager supplies you could carry. There were no paved roads like the Romans had, just dirt tracks, rocky paths, or open wilderness. Imagine trudging for months, your feet blistered and bleeding, your muscles screaming with exhaustion, under the scorching sun or through freezing rain. Food and water would be scarce and often contaminated. Dysentery was rampant, a constant companion that would leave you weakened, dehydrated, and suffering from debilitating stomach cramps. You'd be constantly battling hunger and thirst, your body pushed to its absolute limits, and hygiene practically non-existent. Armies on the march were breeding grounds for disease. Thousands of men, and sometimes women and children, would be crammed together, rarely washing. Their camps quickly becoming cesspits of human and animal waste. Lice, fleas, and rats would be your constant companions. Wounds, whether from battle or simple accidents, would swiftly become infected without any antiseptic knowledge. A broken bone, a deep cut, or even a scratch could easily lead to gangrene and death. You'd be living in a constant state of bodily discomfort, covered in dirt, sweat, and probably a few uninvited passengers. Quirky tidbit: many crusaders wore religious relics or symbols, like crosses made of cloth, sewn onto their tunics as a visible sign of their vows. This also helped distinguish them on the battlefield, though it didn't offer any magical protection from disease or injury. Historians still argue about the primary motivations of the Crusaders, whether they were driven purely by religious zeal, a desire for land and wealth, or a complex mixture of both, and how much influence the papacy truly exerted over individual knights and lords. Then there was the battle itself. Medieval warfare was a terrifying, chaotic, and incredibly brutal affair. Hand-to-hand combat with swords, axes, and spears meant agonizing injuries were common. Arrows, crossbow bolts, and rocks from siege engines added to the carnage. There were no medics on the battlefield. If you fell wounded, your fate was often sealed, either by bleeding out, being trampled, or simply being left to die. Even if you survived the initial engagement, the chances of dying from your wounds or subsequent infection were incredibly high. Beyond the direct violence, the psychological toll was immense. You'd witness horrific atrocities, endure constant fear, and experience profound loss as comrades fell around you. The religious zeal that motivated many could also lead to extreme fanaticism and brutal acts against non-believers, both Muslim and Jewish. The journey was not just physically grueling, but morally complex, forcing you to confront the darker aspects of human nature, including your own. So, while the idea of a holy quest might sound appealing from the comfort of your couch, the reality of being a crusader was a relentless nightmare of physical suffering, rampant disease, and brutal violence. You wouldn't last a day on the march, let alone in battle, without succumbing to exhaustion, sickness, or the sheer horror of a world where faith often led to unparalleled brutality and personal sacrifice. You'd quickly realize that adventure sometimes comes with a price too high to pay. You've wisely retreated from the squalor and brutality of the Crusades, perhaps preferring to avoid getting acquainted with dysentery and medieval battlefield surgery. Now, let's make an enormous leap across Eurasia, both geographically and culturally, and plunge into the vast, swift, and often brutal world of the Mongol Empire. This was the largest contiguous land empire in history, forged by Genghis Khan and his successors, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. It sounds like an epic tale of conquest and power, a force of nature that swept across continents. But for you, a modern individual, living under the Mongol yoke, or simply trying to survive alongside it, would mean adapting to a nomadic, hierarchical, and often terrifyingly violent way of life. First, let's talk about the nomadic existence. Even if you weren't a Mongol yourself, but a subject people, the rhythms of life were often dictated by mobility. Mongols lived in yurts, portable circular dwellings, constantly moving their herds in search of fresh pastures. This meant a life lived largely outdoors, exposed to the elements. Summers could be scorching, winters brutally cold, with fierce winds sweeping across the steppes. You'd be constantly packing up, setting up camp, and living with the bare minimum of possessions. Your modern concept of a permanent home with all its amenities would be utterly alien. Imagine trying to charge your phone when your house moves every few weeks. The Mongol diet was heavily reliant on meat and dairy products from their herds: sheep, goats, horses, and camels. This was incredibly efficient for their lifestyle, providing protein and fats, but it was also monotonous. Vegetables and grains were scarce, typically acquired through trade or tribute from settled peoples. Fermented mare's milk, or kumi, was a staple drink, providing a mild alcoholic kick and some nutrition. But you might find its sour, milky taste an acquired one, and forget delicate table manners. Eating was often a practical affair, done with hands around a communal fire. Quirky tidbit: Mongol warriors often used lightweight, flexible lamellar armor, made from overlapping plates of leather or iron, which allowed for greater mobility on horseback. They also had remarkable long-distance communication systems, using horse relays that could transmit messages across the empire at incredible speed. Historians still argue about the precise tactics and logistics that allowed the Mongol armies to maintain such rapid advances and sustain their vast campaigns across diverse terrains. It's truly a marvel of military organization. Then there's the constant presence of violence and conquest. The Mongol Empire was forged through relentless warfare, and while life within the Pax Mongolica could offer stability and facilitate trade, the journey to that peace was paved with unimaginable brutality. If your city or tribe resisted the Mongols, the consequences were swift and horrific. Entire populations could be massacred, cities razed, and survivors enslaved. You'd live in a constant state of pragmatic fear, knowing that the wrong word or action, especially resistance, could lead to your swift and brutal demise. The saying, "He who resists perishes," was no empty threat. Justice was absolute and often summary. Genghis Khan established a strict legal code, the Yasa, which applied across the empire. Theft, lying, and insubordination were met with harsh, swift punishments, often death. There was little room for mercy, and the emphasis was on maintaining order and loyalty to the Khan. You'd have to be incredibly careful, constantly aware of the prevailing laws and the immense power of the Mongol rulers and their enforcers. So while the Mongol Empire was a truly transformative force in world history, linking East and West in unprecedented ways for you, a modern individual, it would be a shocking immersion into a world of extreme environmental hardship, constant mobility, and an ever-present threat of violence. You wouldn't last a day trying to keep up with their nomadic pace, enduring the elements, or simply navigating a society where absolute power could lead to unimaginable cruelty, or, if you were compliant, grudging survival. You'd quickly discover that the Mongol peace came at a very high and bloody price. You've wisely decided that a nomadic life under the omnipresent threat of Mongol cavalry is unquite your cup of kumi. So let's now jump forward in time and across cultures. Landing in the vibrant, revolutionary period of the Renaissance in Europe, we're talking 14th to 17th centuries, the age of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, and Galileo. It sounds utterly enchanting, doesn't it? A rebirth of art, science, and classical learning, a time of unparalleled creativity and intellectual ferment. And while the artistic and intellectual achievements were indeed astounding, for your average person, and certainly for you, a modern time traveler, the cities were still reeking. Disease-ridden places where life was often nasty, brutish, and short. Imagine yourself strolling through the narrow, crowded streets of Florence or Venice in the year 1500. Your immediate impression wouldn't be of artistic masterpieces, but of overwhelming smells. Despite the artistic explosion, urban sanitation was still primitive at best. Animal waste. Human excrement from chamber pots casually emptied into the streets from upper windows, and general refuse would mingle in the gutters. The air would be a potent mix of stale food, unwashed bodies, and sewage. Imagine trying to appreciate a newly unveiled sculpture while holding your breath against the pervasive stench. Your sophisticated modern nose would be in utter revolt. In the disease situation, grim, the Black Death had ravaged Europe in the preceding centuries, but even after its peak, localized outbreaks of plague, smallpox, typhus, and influenza were regular occurrences. Without germ theory, people understood contagion only vaguely, relying on superstition or ineffective quarantines. The crowded conditions of cities, the lack of clean water, and the poor diet for many meant that if one person fell ill, it could rapidly spread through a neighborhood. Your modern understanding of hygiene and preventative medicine would offer no comfort here, as the tools to implement them simply didn't exist. A simple cut could still fester into a fatal infection. Quirky tidbit. Despite the common image of refined Renaissance figures, hygiene practices were often quite rudimentary. Many people avoided bathing frequently, believing it opened pores to disease. Instead, they relied on perfumes and linen shirts changed daily to absorb sweat and grime. Historians still argue about the true extent to which Renaissance ideas permeated beyond the elite intellectual and artistic circles, and how much the lives of ordinary peasants and laborers actually changed during this supposedly transformative period. Life for the vast majority was still one of hard labor. If you were a peasant, you were tied to the land, working from dawn to dusk, struggling to produce enough food to survive and pay taxes. If you were an urban artisan, you worked long hours in a workshop, often under the strict control of a guildmaster, with little hope of upward mobility. The luxury of patronized art and intellectual discourse was for the very few, the wealthy elite. You'd be too busy struggling for subsistence to appreciate Botticelli. The justice system could be brutal and arbitrary. Torture was common to extract confessions. Punishments like public floggings, mutilation, or executions were spectacles designed to deter crime. Religious authority also held immense power, and expressing dissenting views could lead to charges of heresy with potentially fatal consequences. Imagine a world where your freedom of thought could lead to the stake. So while the Renaissance shines brightly in the annals of human achievement for you, a product of modern comforts and sensibilities, it would be a jarring immersion into a world of pervasive filth, constant disease, and stark social inequalities. You wouldn't last a day without longing for hot running water, antibiotics, and the basic sanitation that makes modern life bearable. You'd quickly realize that beauty and genius often blossomed amidst a truly grim reality. You've braved the Renaissance's charming blend of artistic genius and appalling urban hygiene. Now, let's stay on the European continent, but shift our focus to an island nation, propelling ourselves into Elizabethan England. We're talking late 16th century, the era of William Shakespeare. Queen Elizabeth I, Sir Francis Drake, and the Spanish Armada. It's often painted as a golden age, a time of swashbuckling adventure and poetic brilliance. And while English culture certainly flourished, for you, a modern individual, it would be a world defined by strict social norms, pervasive dangers, and a system of justice that was both public and terrifyingly severe. Imagine walking the cobbled streets of London. Again, the smells. They would be just as potent, if not more so, than Renaissance Italy. Sanitation remained rudimentary. Garbage and human waste were often flung into the streets or flowed into open ditches. The River Thames, though vital for commerce, was a heavily polluted waterway. The air would be thick with the stench of human waste. Animal offal from slaughterhouses, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present smoke from countless wood and coal fires. Your modern nose, accustomed to clean air and proper sewage systems, would be in a constant state of shock. Disease was a lurking, deadly enemy. Outbreaks of plague, smallpox, typhus, and dysentery swept through towns and villages with chilling regularity. Without any understanding of germ theory, people lived in crowded conditions, drank contaminated water, and suffered from poor nutrition, making them highly susceptible. A family member falling ill could swiftly lead to the demise of an entire household and medical care. It was still largely based on humorism and folk remedies. Simple infection, easily treated today with antibiotics, could mean amputation or death. Childbirth remained a perilous event for both mother and infant, with high mortality rates. You'd live with a constant, low-level hum of anxiety about health. Quirky tidbit. Despite the formal portraits, Elizabethan fashion for the wealthy was often incredibly elaborate and uncomfortable. Think stiff ruffs, padded doublets, and corseted gowns. Underneath these layers, personal hygiene was often limited to dry wiping and heavy perfumes. As frequent bathing was still viewed with suspicion, historians still argue about the true literacy rates in Elizabethan England, especially among the common people, and how much access they truly had to the burgeoning world of printed books and pamphlets beyond the plays performed in London. Social norms were incredibly strict, and everyone had their place in a rigid hierarchy. From the queen at the top to the poorest beggar, society was ordered, and deviating from your station could invite censure. Public behavior was highly regulated, and even minor transgressions could lead to public humiliation. Dress codes, for instance, often dictated what different social classes were allowed to wear. God forbid you try to pull off a velvet doublet, if you were just a humble baker. Justice was a public spectacle designed to instill fear. Petty theft could lead to being placed in the stocks or pillory, where you'd be pelted with rotten food by the crowd. More serious crimes meant public hangings, often drawn out in gruesome affairs, performed in prominent locations like Tyburn. Even vagrants or beggars could be severely punished. There was no concept of rehabilitation. Punishment was about retribution and deterrence. You'd need to be incredibly careful about your actions and even your words, as accusations of treason, heresy, or witchcraft, though less frequent than in some other European nations, could still lead to horrific fates. So while Elizabethan England might conjure images of grand theaters and epic naval battles for you, a time traveler, it would be a shocking immersion into a world of pervasive, smells constant disease, brutal public justice, and a rigidly stratified society, where your comfort and safety were far from guaranteed. You wouldn't last a day without succumbing to illness, offending a social norm, or simply being utterly overwhelmed by the harsh realities beneath the veneer of its golden age. You'd realize quickly that Shakespeare's comedies were a welcome escape from a very serious existence. Juve wisely decided that a starring role in an Elizabethan public execution isn't quite your theatrical debut. So, let's hurtle forward once more, crossing into the 18th century, and land in the Age of Enlightenment. This era, roughly from the late 17th to the early 19th century, was a time of immense intellectual ferment, championing reason, science, and individual rights. It sounds like a beacon of progress, a truly modernizing period, doesn't it? You might imagine salons filled with brilliant minds, revolutionary ideas spreading like wildfire, and a general ascent towards a more rational world. While the ideas were indeed revolutionary for the vast majority of people, life still involved widespread poverty, significant disease, and a social structure that often lagged far behind the philosophical ideals. Imagine yourself in, say, Paris or London, the epicenters of Enlightenment thought. In the late 1700s, while philosophers were debating universal rights, the practical reality for most citizens was one of deep social inequality. The burgeoning middle class was growing, but the vast majority were still peasants, laborers, or domestic servants. Their lives were defined by grueling physical labor, long hours, and meager wages, barely enough to subsist. You'd be part of a vast underclass, toiling away while the intellectual elite discussed liberty and equality in comfortable drawing rooms. Your modern expectations of social mobility and economic fairness would be quickly dashed. And despite the focus on reason and scientific inquiry, the daily grind was still incredibly unsanitary. Urban centers, even in the heart of the Enlightenment, were often overcrowded, dirty, and prone to disease. Sewage systems were still primitive or non-existent in most places, with waste routinely dumped into streets or open waterways. The stench, once again, would be overwhelming. A pungent mix of human and animal waste, unwashed bodies, and industrial pollution. Imagine trying to engage in rational thought while constantly battling foul odors and the buzzing of flies. Quirky tidbit. While salon culture flourished among the intellectual elite, It was also a period where coffee houses became vital centers for public discourse and the dissemination of ideas, often challenging traditional authority. These were noisy, smoke-filled places where anyone with a few coins could read a newspaper or engage in lively debate. Historians still argue about the true impact of Enlightenment philosophy on the lives of ordinary people, and whether its emphasis on reason truly led to immediate improvements in daily life, or primarily influenced political and social changes over the longer term. Disease remained a constant threat. Smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, and various fevers continued to decimate populations with terrifying regularity. While early forms of vaccination were emerging, they were not widespread, and the general public had little understanding of germ theory. Medical practices, though slowly improving, were still often brutal and ineffective. Bloodletting and purging remained common treatments. The concept of pain relief during surgery, beyond a shot of alcohol, was still far off. So, while intellectuals were illuminating the mind, the body was still very much in the dark ages of medicine. Food for the common person was simple, often bland, and sometimes insufficient. Bread was the staple, supplemented by vegetables, and meat was a luxury. Crop failures due to bad weather or agricultural practices could still lead to widespread famine, especially for the poor, highlighting the precariousness of life even in this enlightened era. So while the Age of Enlightenment gave us profound ideas that shaped the modern world, for you, a time traveler, it would be a surprising dichotomy. You'd witness incredible intellectual breakthroughs, but your daily life would be defined by persistent poverty, pervasive unsanitary conditions, and the ever-present threat of deadly disease. You wouldn't last a day without longing for modern plumbing, accessible healthcare, and a society where grand ideas about human rights were actually applied to everyone, not just a privileged few. You'd realize that even in the age of reason, basic survival was still often left to chance. You've had your fill of philosophical debates amidst the pervasive stench of Enlightenment-era cities. Perhaps a bit of revolutionary fervor would spice things up. Let's plunge into the heart of the French Revolution, specifically Paris in the late 18th century, say 1792, during the height of its tumultuous changes. This was a period of incredible societal upheaval, grand ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the dramatic overthrow of an ancient monarchy. It sounds like a thrilling, world-changing moment, doesn't it? But for you, a modern individual, daily life would be a chaotic, dangerous, and incredibly uncertain existence, where the guillotine loomed large, and yesterday's hero could be tomorrow's victim. Imagine waking up in revolutionary Paris. The air, though perhaps less odorous than pre-revolutionary times due to some initial sanitation efforts, would be thick with tension. The streets, still narrow and crowded, would be filled not just with the usual bustle, but with fervent political activity. Pamphlets plastered everywhere, impassioned speeches in public squares, and the constant murmur of suspicion. You'd hear cries of "Vive la," alongside whispers of aristocrats and traitors. The very atmosphere would be charged with anxiety and paranoia. Your modern sense of order and safety would be completely shattered. Food shortages were a constant source of unrest. The price of bread, a staple, fluctuated wildly, often leading to riots. You'd spend hours queuing for basic necessities, unsure if you'd get enough for your family. The economic upheaval meant widespread unemployment, and even if you had a job, your wages might not keep pace with rampant inflation. The simple act of feeding yourself and your loved ones would be a daily, desperate struggle. Quirky tidbit. During the Revolution, people adopted new fashions to signal their revolutionary zeal. The sans-culottes, or long trousers, instead of the knee breeches favored by the aristocracy. And the red Phrygian cap became a widely recognized symbol of liberty. Historians still argue about the true turning points and inevitable nature of the French Revolution, and whether its radicalization was a necessary evil to achieve its goals, or a tragic descent into unnecessary bloodshed. The political climate was a terrifying tightrope walk. Factions constantly vied for power, and yesterday's allies could become today's enemies. The Committee of Public Safety, under Robespierre, unleashed the Reign of Terror, during which thousands of perceived enemies of the revolution were arrested, tried by revolutionary tribunals, and swiftly executed. Speaking out, even inadvertently, against the dominant faction could lead to your denunciation. Your neighbor, your baker, even a street vendor could be an informer. Imagine living in a society where a misplaced comment or a wrong acquaintance could send you to the scaffold. And the guillotine, it wasn't just a symbol, it was a daily reality. Public executions were frequent spectacles, often drawing large crowds. The sight of the infamous blade rising and falling would be a constant, chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the absolute power of the revolutionary government. You'd walk by the Place de la, seeing the stains on the cobblestones, knowing that countless heads had rolled there. Your modern sensibilities regarding human rights and due process would be utterly appalled. Even seemingly minor aspects of daily life were affected. The old calendar was replaced, new forms of address were mandated, traditional religious practices were suppressed. Every aspect of society was being re-engineered, leading to a constant sense of disorientation and instability. You'd be living through a period of profound social engineering where your past beliefs and habits were actively discouraged or even outlawed. So, while the French Revolution ignited the flame of modern political thought, for you, a time traveler, it would be a harrowing immersion into a world of chaos, scarcity, and pervasive fear. You wouldn't last a day without struggling to find food, inadvertently offending a powerful faction, or simply succumbing to the overwhelming psychological pressure of living under the constant shadow of the guillotine. You'd quickly learn that liberty and equality sometimes come with a shockingly high and bloody price. You've wisely decided that a close encounter with the guillotine is into your preferred form of historical tourism. So let's leave the political tumult of revolutionary Paris and head west across the ocean, deep into the American Wild West of the 19th century. We're talking about the era of cowboys, outlaws, gold rushes, and vast untamed landscapes. Popular culture, especially Hollywood, has painted a romantic, adventurous picture of rugged individualism and wide-open spaces. But the reality of life in the Wild West was far more dangerous, often mundane, and definitely less glamorous than the silver screen suggests. Imagine yourself in a dusty, burgeoning frontier town like Dodge City or Deadwood, say in the 1870s. Forget the clean saloons and dramatic shootouts you see in movies. These towns were often hastily constructed, with unpaved roads that turned into a muddy, manure-filled quagmire with every rain. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Outhouses were common, and waste management was largely non-existent, leading to pervasive, unpleasant odors. The air would be thick with dust, horse droppings, and the lingering smell of unwashed bodies. Your modern nose, accustomed to fresh air and basic cleanliness, would be in constant protest. Violence was a constant low-level hum, though perhaps not always in the form of dramatic gunfights at high noon. Brawls, drunken disputes, and acts of vigilantism were common. There was often little effective law enforcement, and what existed was frequently corrupt or overwhelmed. Your safety largely depended on your ability to defend yourself or your luck in avoiding trouble. If you were injured, medical care was incredibly basic. A doctor might be hours or days away, and their remedies often consisted of dubious tonics or drastic measures like amputation, all performed without anesthesia. A simple broken leg could lead to a lifelong disability, or worse. Quirky tidbit. Many cowboys were actually former slaves seeking new opportunities after the Civil War, and a significant portion were Hispanic. The image of the exclusively white cowboy is a Hollywood invention. Historians still argue about the true level of daily violence in the American West, whether it was as rampant as popular culture suggests, or if periods of stability were more common than the sensationalized accounts imply. Life itself was incredibly harsh and physically demanding. If you were a cowboy, you'd spend weeks or months on cattle drives, enduring grueling hours in the saddle, exposed to the elements, sleeping under the stars, and constantly battling thirst, hunger, and loneliness. The pay was low, and the work was dangerous. If you were a farmer or homesteader, you faced the immense challenge of taming unforgiving land, battling unpredictable weather, and struggling to make a living from the soil. There were no comfortable modern machines. Everything was done with manual labor and brute force. Isolation was another significant challenge. Beyond the boomtowns, vast stretches of the West were sparsely populated. Months could pass without seeing new faces, and news from the outside world would arrive slowly, if at all. This solitude, combined with the relentless physical demands and constant danger, could take a significant mental toll. Entertainment was simple: local dances, card games, or storytelling around a campfire. There were no streaming services, no social media, just the vast silence of the plains. And for women, life was arguably even harder. They faced the same physical dangers and isolation, often while managing households, raising families in incredibly primitive conditions, and enduring the perils of childbirth with little to no medical assistance. Their resilience was truly remarkable. So, while the Wild West evokes images of freedom and adventure, for you, a time traveler expecting modern comforts and safety, would be a shocking immersion into a world of pervasive discomfort, constant danger, and unrelenting physical hardship. You wouldn't last a day without longing for hot running water, reliable medical care, and the basic rule of law. You'd quickly realize that frontier justice was often anything but just, and freedom came at an incredibly high price. You've wisely decided that the romanticized dust and danger of the Wild West is a bit too wild for your tastes. So let's stay in 19th century America, but narrow our focus to a specific, feverish phenomenon: the gold rushes. We're talking California in 1849, or the Klondike in the late 1890s. Popular imagination conjures images of instant wealth, nuggets lying in riverbeds, and daring prospectors striking it rich. But the reality for the vast majority of gold seekers was one of grueling, back-breaking labor, pervasive squalor, desperate competition, and often utter failure. Imagine yourself arriving in a gold rush boomtown. It's not a picturesque village. It's a chaotic, sprawling encampment of tents, rough shacks, and hastily constructed saloons. The ground is churned to mud or dust depending on the weather. Sanitation? Open pits served as latrines, garbage piled up. And the air would be a potent cocktail of human and animal waste, stale tobacco, and desperation. Clean water was a luxury, and often contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Your modern immune system, used to filtered water and proper waste disposal, would stage an immediate and violent protest. The work itself was brutal. If you were a 49er, you'd spend your days knee-deep in freezing rivers, panning for gold, or digging deep into rocky hillsides with pickaxes and shovels. It was relentless physical labor, from dawn to dusk, under the scorching sun or in the biting cold. Your muscles would ache constantly, your hands would be raw and blistered, and your body would be perpetually tired. And for what? The vast majority found little to no gold. The dream of striking it rich was just that, a dream. For all but a fortunate few, you'd be working harder than you ever have in your life, for little to no reward, facing constant disappointment. Quirky tidbit. During the Klondike Gold Rush, the Canadian government required prospectors to bring a year's supply of food. Over the Chilkoot Pass to prevent starvation, this daunting requirement meant thousands of grueling trips back and forth, carrying heavy loads up steep, icy slopes. Historians still argue whether the gold rushes were primarily economic engines that jump-started regional development, or if they were largely ephemeral bubbles that caused more social disruption and personal ruin than lasting prosperity for the average participant. The social environment was incredibly cutthroat. Competition for claims was fierce, and disputes often escalated into violence. Law and order were often rudimentary, enforced by self-appointed vigilantes or corrupt sheriffs. Your property, your claim, and even your life could be at risk from desperate individuals or organized gangs. There was a palpable sense of greed and suspicion in the air. You wouldn't find a strong, supportive community. Instead, you'd find a transient population driven by individual ambition, often at the expense of others. Food was expensive and monotonous. Basic staples like flour, beans, and salted meat were often imported and sold at exorbitant prices. Fresh produce was rare, leading to vitamin deficiencies and diseases like scurvy. Imagine eating the same bland, unhealthy fare day after day, while constantly expending massive amounts of energy. And forget about entertainment or comfort. Leisure time, when it existed, was usually spent in gambling halls and saloons, often leading to more debt and despair. So, while the allure of gold might draw you in, the reality of the gold rushes was a shocking immersion into a world of intense physical suffering. pervasive disease, desperate competition, and frequent failure.
Ouch.
You wouldn't last a day without succumbing to exhaustion, sickness, or the profound psychological weight of shattered dreams amid squalid, dangerous conditions. You'd quickly learn that for every glittering nugget found, there were 1,000 broken picks and 1,000,000 broken spirits. You've wisely turned your back on the muddy, often fruitless pursuit of gold. So let's hurtle forward in time to a different kind of boom, a dizzying era of prosperity and cultural revolution, the Roaring Twenties. We're talking 1920s America, jazz music, flappers, prohibition, and a seemingly endless economic boom. It sounds like a fun, vibrant, and incredibly modern time, a stark contrast to the grim historical periods we've just explored. And while it was certainly a period of immense change and excitement, for you, a modern individual, it harbored significant underlying tensions, social restrictions, and economic vulnerabilities that would make it a less than comfortable ride. Imagine stepping into a bustling city like New York or Chicago in 1925. The sheer energy would be exhilarating, skyscrapers rising, automobiles filling the streets, and a vibrant nightlife bubbling with illegal speakeasies. But beneath the surface, you'd find a society grappling with profound changes and contradictions. The era of prohibition, for instance, meant that alcohol was illegal, while many openly flouted the law in speakeasies. Accessing alcohol was a clandestine affair, often involving dangerous, unregulated moonshine that could be toxic. And the pervasive presence of organized crime, fueled by bootlegging, would be a constant, unsettling undercurrent. You'd feel the tension, the illegality, and the hypocrisy, making simple social interactions surprisingly complex. Social norms, despite the image of wild flappers, were still quite conservative by today's standards. Racial segregation was deeply entrenched, especially in the South, where Jim Crow laws enforced strict separation and discrimination. Women had just gained the right to vote, but still faced significant barriers in professional life and societal expectations. Immigrants often faced prejudice and hardship. Your modern sensibilities of inclusivity and civil rights would be starkly challenged by the open discrimination and prejudice of the era. You'd find yourself navigating a world where vast segments of the population were treated as second-class citizens. Quirky tidbit, the flapper style, characterized by short bobbed hair, shorter dresses, and a rebellious attitude, was a significant departure from Victorian norms, symbolizing a newfound freedom for some women. However, it was far from universally accepted, and often seen as scandalous by older generations. Historians still argue whether the economic prosperity of the 1920s was genuinely widespread, or if it largely benefited the wealthy, creating an uneven distribution of wealth that contributed to the later economic collapse. The economic boom itself, while dazzling, was built on shaky foundations. Speculation in the stock market was rampant, often fueled by borrowed money, creating an illusion of endless growth. Many ordinary people invested their life savings, often without understanding the risks. While it felt like everyone was getting rich, the underlying fragility of the financial system was a ticking time bomb. Your modern awareness of market crashes would make you incredibly uneasy, watching this giddy dance towards an inevitable cliff. And despite the advances, daily life still lacked many of your modern conveniences. Air conditioning was rare. Refrigeration was still new and expensive, limiting fresh food options. Healthcare, while improving, still lacked antibiotics and many of the sophisticated diagnostic tools you take for granted. Childhood diseases like polio and diphtheria were still significant threats. The Roaring Twenties were still a noisy, smoky, less hygienic world than yours. So, while the Roaring Twenties offered a thrilling glimpse of modernity, for you, a time traveler, it would be a surprisingly uncomfortable blend of glittering excitement and underlying social tension. You'd be navigating a world where pleasure often felt illicit. Social freedoms were far from universal, and economic stability was built on sand. You wouldn't last a day without feeling the simmering anxieties beneath the jazz age exuberance, or simply longing for the consistent comforts and safety nets of your own time. You'd realize quickly that the party, however grand, was destined to end. You've witnessed the exhilarating, yet ultimately fragile dance of the Roaring Twenties. Let us abruptly snap out of that jazz-infused dream and plummet into the crushing reality that followed. The Great Depression, we're talking 1930s America, a decade defined by economic collapse. Mass unemployment, widespread poverty, and a profound sense of despair. It sounds incredibly bleak, doesn't it? A far cry from the modern comforts and economic stability you take for granted. For you, a modern individual, daily life would be an immediate, gut-wrenching struggle for basic survival, where dignity was constantly tested and hope was a rare commodity. Imagine waking up, not in your comfortable bed, but perhaps on a straw mattress in a cramped, unheated tenement apartment, or even a makeshift shanty in a Hooverville on the outskirts of a city. There's no work. The factory gates are shut, the banks have closed, and your savings, if you had any, are gone. Your immediate concern would be food. You'd join endless bread lines, waiting hours for a meager handout, or frequent soup kitchens, grateful for whatever thin gruel was offered. The shame and humiliation of relying on charity would be a constant gnawing feeling. Your modern sense of security and self-sufficiency would be utterly shattered within hours. Money, what little there was, had to be stretched to its absolute limit. Every penny counted. Families would share cramped living spaces, pool meager resources, and make do with whatever they had. Clothes would be patched and mended until they fell apart. Luxuries were unimaginable. Even simple comforts like electricity or running water were often cut off if bills couldn't be paid. You'd be constantly calculating, constantly worrying about how to put the next meal on the table. Quirky tidbit. During the Depression, many people made clothes and blankets from flour sacks, which often had patterns printed on them. Companies eventually started printing sacks with more attractive designs to help people make better clothing. Historians still argue about the primary causes of the Great Depression. Whether it was primarily the stock market crash, banking failures, or deeper structural issues within the global economy, not what policies ultimately pulled the world out of it. Healthcare was a luxury few could afford. If you fell ill or had an accident and you didn't have money for a doctor, you simply suffered. Hospitals were primarily for the truly destitute or those with charitable support. Diseases related to malnutrition and poor sanitation, like pellagra and tuberculosis, saw a resurgence. Infant mortality rates climbed. You'd live with the constant fear that illness, already a burden, could become an unbearable one, tipping your family into even deeper despair. Beyond the urban centers, the rural areas, particularly the Dust Bowl states of the American Midwest, faced an additional, devastating layer of hardship. Decades of unsustainable farming practices, combined with severe drought, led to massive dust storms that literally turned day into night. Crops failed, topsoil blew away, and respiratory illnesses from the dust became rampant. Thousands of families were forced to abandon their farms and become Okies or Arkies, migrating west in desperate search of work. Often facing discrimination and exploitation, imagine your home, your livelihood, literally blowing away in a cloud of dust. The psychological toll was immense. Widespread unemployment led to feelings of hopelessness, shame, and a sense of lost purpose. Men, traditionally the breadwinners, felt emasculated by their inability to provide. Families broke apart under the strain. There was a constant undercurrent of anxiety and despair that permeated everyday life, a grim silence replacing the roar of the previous decade. So while the Great Depression forged a generation of resilience and laid the groundwork for social safety nets, for you, a time traveler, it would be an immediate, profound shock. You wouldn't last a day without succumbing to the gnawing hunger, pervasive anxiety, or the sheer hopelessness of living in a world where the most basic necessities were a daily struggle. You'd quickly realize that material wealth isn't just about comfort. It's often about dignity and survival itself. You've witnessed the grim struggle and pervasive despair of the Great Depression, a time when even the simplest comforts were luxuries. Now, let's transition into an even more momentous and globally impactful period. World War II. We're talking 1940s. Specifically, life on the home front in a country deeply involved, like the United States or Great Britain. You might imagine a unified nation rallying behind a cause, patriotic fervor, and a sense of shared sacrifice. And while that spirit of unity and determination was undeniably present for you, a modern individual, daily, and a profound disruption to every aspect of existence, even far from the battlefield. Imagine waking up in a small house in wartime London or a bustling American city. Your morning routine would immediately be dictated by scarcity. No abundant hot coffee, no endless choices at the grocery store. Everything was rationed. Butter, sugar, meat, gasoline, even clothing. You'd have ration books, carefully tearing out coupons for your meager allowances. Food was often monotonous and bland, relying heavily on dried goods and whatever vegetables you could grow in your victory garden. Imagine constantly feeling hungry, knowing that your dinner plate was carefully measured and strictly limited. Your modern ability to buy whatever you want, whenever you want, would be a distant memory. Beyond food, almost everything else was scarce too. Tires for cars, nylon stockings, rubber, metal, all were diverted to the war effort. This meant a lot of making do, repairing old items, and creatively repurposing things. Fashion was functional and utilitarian. There was no casual shopping spree. Every purchase was a calculated necessity. Even getting around was difficult, with gas rationing and reduced public transport. Your easy access to consumer goods and personal mobility would be utterly curtailed. Quirky tidbit. In Britain, Dig for Victory campaigns encouraged citizens to grow their own food, even in parks and gardens, to help combat rationing and ensure food security. Families would raise chickens and rabbits in their backyards. Historians still argue about the precise impact of women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers during World War II, whether this temporarily disrupted traditional gender roles or permanently altered expectations for women. Societal contributions in the post-war era, a pervasive sense of anxiety would cling to daily life like a second skin. If you were in Britain, the Blitz meant regular air raids, the terrifying wail of air raid sirens, and nights spent huddled in underground shelters, listening to the drone of enemy bombers and the distant thud of explosions. Even in the U.S., far from the direct bombing, families worried constantly about loved ones fighting overseas. Every telegram, every radio broadcast, carried the potential for devastating news. Propaganda was everywhere, reminding you of the enemy and the sacrifices needed. You'd live with a constant, low-level hum of dread, knowing that lives were being lost and the future was uncertain. Children were evacuated from cities, families were separated, and communities were transformed. Many women entered factories, performing jobs traditionally done by men, adapting to grueling shifts and dangerous conditions. The concept of normal was redefined, replaced by a collective effort toward survival and victory. Your private life would become public, subsumed by the national effort. So, while the home front during World War II exemplifies incredible resilience and unity, for you, a time traveler, it would be a shocking immersion into a world of constant scarcity, pervasive anxiety, and profound personal sacrifice. You wouldn't last a day without longing for hot water, unlimited food, and the basic peace of mind that comes from living in a world not gripped by total war. You'd quickly realize that the cost of victory wasn't just paid on the battlefield. It was paid every single day in every single home. You've just experienced the profound sacrifices and anxieties of the World War II home front, a testament to collective resolve. Now let's move past the hot war, but not quite into the tranquil present. We're stepping into the Cold War, specifically the mid to late 20th century, roughly from the 1950s to the 1980s. This wasn't a war of direct open conflict between superpowers, but a prolonged period of ideological struggle, proxy wars, and a pervasive, essential paranoia about nuclear annihilation. For you, a modern individual, daily life would be tinged with an underlying sense of dread, constant vigilance, and a unique kind of psychological warfare. Imagine waking up in the 1960s, perhaps in a suburban American home or an apartment in Soviet bloc Eastern Europe. Your biggest morning worry wouldn't just be traffic. It would be the silent threat of a nuclear strike. Deccan-covered drills were common in schools, teaching children to hide under their desks in case of an atomic bomb attack, as if a wooden desk would offer any real protection. Fallout shelters were built, often with stocked supplies, creating a chilling reminder of potential Armageddon lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. You'd live with the knowledge that at any moment, miscalculation or an escalation could plunge the world into a catastrophic war that would make all previous conflicts seem minor. Propaganda was omnipresent, shaping your perception of the world. In the West, you'd be constantly reminded of the evils of communism, the dangers of Soviet expansion, and the necessity of vigilance. In the East, you'd be fed narratives of capitalist exploitation and the superiority of the socialist system. Information was carefully controlled, and dissenting opinions were often suppressed or viewed with suspicion. Imagine a world where your daily news was filtered through a political lens, designed to reinforce a specific ideology, and where questioning the official narrative could have serious repercussions. Quirky tidbit. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, public anxiety in both the U.S. and the USSR reached fever pitch, with some families actively preparing their fallout shelters and discussing last-minute plans. It was one of the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. Historians still argue about the precise moment the Cold War truly began, and whether its end was primarily due to economic pressures on the Soviet Union, internal dissent, or a shift in international diplomacy. Beyond the nuclear threat, daily life in the Cold War era also varied significantly depending on where you were. If you were in a Western country, you might experience the rise of consumer culture and increasing prosperity, but always with the backdrop of global tension. If you were in the Soviet bloc, you'd face a different set of challenges: economic shortages, limited consumer choices, pervasive surveillance by the state, and restrictions on travel and information. You'd feel the weight of an authoritarian system, constantly aware of the reach of the secret police and the lack of personal freedoms you take for granted. The space race, the arms race, proxy wars in Vietnam or Afghanistan. These global struggles trickled down into everyday life, influencing government spending, scientific research, and popular culture. Even seemingly innocent things like science fiction movies or comic books often carried subtle Cold War messages. You'd be living in a world where seemingly every action had geopolitical implications. And the grand chess game of global power was constantly playing out in the background of your private life. So, while the Cold War didn't involve direct global battles, for you, a time traveler, it would be a surprisingly stressful immersion into a world of pervasive paranoia, ideological struggle, and the constant chilling threat of nuclear annihilation. You wouldn't last a day without feeling the oppressive weight of a world teetering on the brink, or longing for the openness and relative peace of your own time. You'd quickly realize that a Cold War could still cast a very long, very frightening shadow over daily existence. You've navigated the chilling anxieties and geopolitical tensions of the Cold War, a period where the greatest threats were often unseen, but always felt. Now, for our final journey, let's travel back in time once more, to ancient imperial China, a civilization that endured for millennia and saw a succession of powerful dynasties. We're talking about a vast, complex society with incredible innovations, profound philosophies, and a highly centralized state. It sounds like a world of deep wisdom and cultural richness. But for you, a modern individual, daily life in ancient imperial China would be characterized by rigid societal expectations, a powerful and often distant state, and constant pressures to conform, lest you risk severe consequences. Imagine yourself as a peasant farmer in, say, the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty. Your life would be inextricably linked to the land and the emperor. You'd spend your days toiling in the fields, producing rice or millet, your back aching under the sun, often in sweltering humidity. Agricultural techniques were advanced for their time, but still relied on immense manual labor. Your diet would be primarily grain-based, supplemented by vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury for most. The goal was simple: produce enough to feed your family and, crucially, to pay your heavy taxes, often in the form of grain or labor. Failure to meet these quotas could result in brutal punishments, including flogging or forced servitude. The imperial state was an all-encompassing presence, even in the most remote villages. A vast bureaucracy staffed by educated scholar officials managed everything from tax collection to justice and public works. You'd be expected to obey without question, your life governed by detailed laws and imperial edicts. The concept of individual rights as you know it simply didn't exist. You were a subject of the emperor, expected to contribute to the harmony and stability of the empire. Quirky tidbit: ancient China invented paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass centuries before the West. Yet ironically, paper money often led to rampant inflation during some dynasties. making it incredibly difficult for common people to manage their finances. Historians still argue about the true influence of Confucianism versus legalism on the daily lives of common people in different dynasties, in which philosophy ultimately had a more pervasive impact on social order and individual behavior. Justice was administered through local magistrates, and punishments were often harsh and public. Flogging, branding, and even mutilation were common for various offenses, from theft to insubordination. Capital punishment, usually by decapitation, was reserved for severe crimes and often carried out publicly. There was little concept of appeal or due process. The magistrate's word was often final. You'd live in constant fear of official corruption or being accused of a crime, knowing that the justice system offered little mercy. Beyond the immediate concerns of the state, life was also incredibly precarious due to natural disasters. The Yellow River, often called China's Sorrow, would periodically flood, devastating vast regions and causing immense loss of life and famine. Droughts, locust plagues, and epidemics also swept through the population with terrifying regularity. While the state sometimes organized relief efforts, they were often insufficient, leaving millions to suffer or perish. Your social position would be fixed. While theoretical upward mobility through the imperial examination system existed, it was largely inaccessible to the vast majority of peasants, who lacked the time, resources, and literacy to pursue such an education. Your life's path was generally determined by your birth, with little opportunity for change. You'd live within a rigid family structure, where filial piety and respect for elders were paramount, often sacrificing personal desires for the sake of the family unit. So, while ancient imperial China built a civilization of unparalleled longevity, cultural richness, and administrative sophistication for you, a time traveler, it would be a shocking immersion into a world of relentless labor, pervasive state control, harsh justice, and limited personal freedom. You wouldn't last a day without struggling under the weight of its stringent expectations. Fearing the reach of the imperial bureaucracy, or simply longing for the autonomy and comforts of your own era, you'd quickly realize that the mandate of heaven was a heavy burden, not just for the emperor, but for every single subject. The journey through these various historical landscapes, from the unhygienic streets of ancient Greece to the anxiety-ridden suburbs of the Cold War, reminds us just how profoundly different life has been for the vast majority of humanity throughout history. We've seen the grinding labor, the omnipresent threat of disease, the lack of basic comforts, and the constant struggle for survival against nature, state, and fellow humans. It makes you truly appreciate the silent miracles of modern sanitation, medicine, and the often unnoticed freedoms we enjoy every single day. Think about your soft bed, your running water, the food in your fridge, the peace and quiet of your home. These aren't just conveniences. They're luxuries that billions throughout history could only dream of. So as you drift off tonight, let the comfort of your present wash over you. There are no Roman roads to jostle you, no medieval doctors with leeches, no Viking raids on the horizon, no factory whistles demanding 16 hours of your day. Just quiet, warmth, and safety. The past was certainly a place where you wouldn't last a day, but the present is waiting for you with sweet dreams.